The gymnasium lights cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor, illuminating a space where dreams were supposed to be decided by skill, determination, and the pure measure of athletic ability. But in America during the early decades of the 20th century, no space was truly neutral, no competition existed outside the framework of racial hierarchy, and no achievement by a black athlete could be allowed to stand without challenge if it threatened the comfortable assumptions of white supremacy. The basketball court, like every other arena of American life, was a battleground where the question of who deserved to succeed and who deserved to fail was always entangled with questions of race, power, and the desperate need of those in authority to maintain the social order that benefited them. Cumberland Posey Jr. was born into a world of contradictions and possibilities, the son of a man who had managed to carve out a space of relative prosperity and influence in a society designed to deny such achievements to people of his race. His father, Cumberland Posey Sr., had become one of the wealthiest black men in Pittsburgh through shrewd business dealings and relentless work, accumulating properties and establishing enterprises at a time when the vast majority of black Americans were locked into sharecropping, domestic service, or the most menial industrial labor. The Posey family lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly white, sent their children to schools where they were among the few black students, and moved through spaces that most African Americans of that era could never access. Yet this relative privilege came with its own burdens, its own complexities, its own reminders that no amount of money or education or refinement could fully erase the stigma that white society attached to black skin. Young Cumberland, known as Cum to family and friends, grew up watching his father navigate the treacherous waters of being a successful black businessman in a white-dominated world, learning the delicate art of asserting oneself without appearing threatening, of claiming dignity without provoking backlash, of achieving success while constantly being reminded of one's supposedly inferior status. These lessons would serve him well, though they would also exact a psychological toll that he would carry throughout his life. He was educated at elite institutions, including Duquesne University and later Penn State, where he pursued engineering studies, demonstrating intellectual abilities that gave lie to every racist theory about black mental inferiority. But it was on the athletic fields and courts that he would find both his greatest triumphs and his most bitter frustrations. Basketball in the early 1900s was still a relatively new sport, having been invented only decades earlier, and its rules and conventions were still being established. The game had not yet achieved the commercial and cultural significance it would later attain, had not yet become the winter obsession of millions of fans, had not yet developed the institutional structures that would govern it in future generations. It was played primarily in YMCAs, church gymnasiums, and college facilities, with teams forming and dissolving with fluid informality, with competitions organized through networks of personal relationships rather than formal leagues. Into this environment, Cumberland Posey brought a combination of athletic skill, basketball intelligence, and competitive fire that made him one of the best players of his generation. He excelled at every level he competed, demonstrating a court vision and basketball IQ that allowed him to control games even when he was not the highest scorer. He understood spacing and timing, could anticipate movements before they happened, possessed the kind of instinctive feel for the game that cannot be taught but only nurtured in those fortunate enough to possess it naturally. His teams won consistently, dominated their opponents with a combination of skilled play and tactical sophistication that reflected his own deep understanding of the sport. By the time he was competing at the collegiate level, he had established himself as one of the premier players in the region, someone who could change the outcome of a game through his presence on the court. But Cumberland Posey's ambitions extended beyond simply playing the game. He understood that basketball, like every other aspect of American life, was structured in ways that limited opportunities for black athletes, that the best teams and most prestigious competitions were closed to those of his race, that even extraordinary talent could be contained and marginalized if the institutional structures were designed to exclude. So he began to build his own structure, to create opportunities where none existed, to establish a team that could compete at the highest levels regardless of the color barriers that white institutions maintained. In 1912, he took control of a team that would become known as the Loewendy Big Five, transforming it into one of the most dominant basketball teams of the era. The Loewendy Big Five became more than just a basketball team. It became a statement of possibility, a demonstration that black athletes, when given the opportunity to compete and organize on their own terms, could achieve excellence that matched or exceeded anything white teams could produce. Cumberland Posey recruited the best black players he could find, molded them into a cohesive unit, instilled in them a disciplined approach to the game that emphasized teamwork and basketball intelligence over individual heroics. The team practiced with an intensity that bordered on obsession, understanding that they would have to be not just good but undeniably excellent if they were to overcome the prejudice they would inevitably face. They traveled throughout the region, challenging teams wherever they could arrange games, building a reputation for skillful play and consistent victory. The problems began when they started winning too consistently, when their dominance became so obvious that it could not be dismissed or ignored, when white teams that had agreed to play them found themselves humiliated on the court by opponents they had assumed would be inferior. The racial assumptions of the era insisted that black athletes might possess certain physical advantages, might be capable of crude athleticism, but lacked the intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking necessary to excel at sports that required mental acuity and tactical sophistication. Basketball, with its emphasis on spacing, timing, set plays, and court vision, was supposed to be precisely the kind of sport where white intellectual superiority would manifest itself clearly. The success of the Loendi Big Five threatened this comfortable narrative, forced white players and coaches and fans to confront the possibility that the racial theories they had been taught might be wrong. In 1920, Cumberland Posey and his team entered a tournament that should have been their crowning achievement, a competition that brought together the best teams in the region for a championship that would establish clear supremacy. The Loendi Big Five came into the tournament as favorites, their record of dominance over previous seasons making them the team to beat. They advanced through the early rounds with relative ease, their skilled play and tactical sophistication overwhelming opponents who had underestimated them. The semi-finals brought a harder test, but they prevailed, setting up a championship game that would determine the best team in the region. The anticipation was enormous. Fans packed the gymnasium, newspapers sent reporters to cover what promised to be a historic game, and Cumberland Posey prepared his team for the biggest game of their collective lives. But on the morning of the championship game, the organizers announced a change. The rules that had governed the tournament, the rules that every team had been playing under throughout the competition, the rules that had been established before the tournament began and that everyone had agreed to follow, were suddenly being modified. The changes were technical and seemingly minor, adjustments to things like the size of the playing area, the number of timeouts allowed, the specifics of how certain violations would be called. But their effect was anything but minor. The modification systematically advantaged the style of play that the white teams employed while disadvantaging the approach that had made the Loendi Big Five so successful. It was a surgical strike against black excellence, a calculated attempt to tilt the playing field after it had become clear that on a level surface, the black team would win. Cumberland Posey faced an impossible choice. He could refuse to play under the changed rules, could protest the obvious unfairness of altering the conditions in the middle of the competition, could walk away and preserve his dignity while forfeiting the championship his team had earned the right to compete for. Or he could accept the changed rules, could swallow the humiliation of being so blatantly targeted, could try to win anyway despite the deliberate disadvantages being imposed. To protest was to risk being labeled as difficult, as unwilling to compete, as making excuses before the game was even played. To accept was to participate in his own oppression, to legitimize a system that was rigged against him. Either choice carried enormous costs, and neither offered a path to anything resembling justice. He chose to play. His team took the court knowing that the rules had been changed specifically to stop them, knowing that the referees would likely enforce those rules in ways that further disadvantaged them, knowing that they would have to be so much better than their opponents that victory would be undeniable even under these circumstances. And they nearly succeeded. Despite everything, despite the changed rules and the hostile officiating and the weight of playing against not just their opponents but the entire system that had organized the tournament, the Loendi Big Five competed with ferocity and skill. They executed their plays with precision, moved the ball with purpose, defended with intensity. For stretches of the game, it seemed like they might overcome everything that had been arrayed against them, might win despite the deliberate attempt to ensure their defeat. But the accumulation of small disadvantages, the technical changes that had been made to the rules, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that referees enforced those rules differently depending on which team was benefiting, all of it took its toll over the course of the game. Calls that might have gone the Loendi Big Five's way went to their opponents instead. Plays that should have resulted in scoring opportunities were nullified by technical violations. The pace and rhythm that the team had established throughout the tournament were disrupted by the modified rules. And in the end, after 40 minutes of basketball played under conditions designed to ensure a particular outcome, the Loendi Big Five fell short. They lost the championship not because they were the inferior team, not because they had been outplayed or outcoached, but because the authorities had literally changed the rules mid-competition to prevent them from winning. The aftermath was a study in the mechanics of racial gaslighting. Newspapers that covered the game made no mention of the rule changes, reported the results as if they had been determined purely by athletic competition, praised the winners for their skill and determination without acknowledging the advantages they had been given. When Cumberland Posey attempted to publicize what had happened, to explain to the broader public how his team had been cheated, he was dismissed as a sore loser, as someone making excuses for his team's failure, as unable to accept defeat with grace. The very act of pointing out the injustice was treated as evidence of poor character, while those who had perpetrated the injustice were celebrated and honored. It was a perfect encapsulation of how systemic racism operated, how it could disadvantage black people while simultaneously denying that any disadvantage existed, how it could rig the game while insisting that the outcome was fair. Cumberland Posey would continue to be involved in sports for the rest of his life, would go on to achieve even greater success in other arenas, particularly in Negro League baseball where he would become one of the most important and influential figures in the sport's history. But the experience of that championship game, the bitter taste of having victory snatched away through brazen rule manipulation, would stay with him always. It was a lesson in the limits of individual achievement in a society structured around racial hierarchy, a demonstration that no matter how skilled or prepared or deserving a black person might be, the system could always find ways to deny them the rewards of their efforts if those in power felt threatened by their success. The story of that championship game, of the rules changed mid-match to stop a black team from winning, reveals something essential about the nature of racial oppression in America. It was not always dramatic or violent, did not always involve lynch mobs or burning crosses or explicitly stated policies of exclusion. Sometimes it operated through seemingly neutral technicalities, through small adjustments to rules and procedures, through the exercise of authority in ways that appeared legitimate on the surface but that had the effect of maintaining racial hierarchy. These methods were in some ways more insidious than overt violence because they were harder to name and challenge, because they could be enacted while maintaining a facade of fairness, because they allowed those who benefited from racial hierarchy to deny that they were perpetuating injustice. For Cumberland Posey and his teammates, the injustice was clear and undeniable. They had been the best team in the tournament. They had earned the right to compete for the championship under the rules that had governed every previous game. Those rules had been changed specifically to stop them from winning. This was not paranoia or imagination or excuse-making. It was simple fact, observable by anyone who cared to look honestly at what had happened. But the broader society, committed to the mythology of meritocracy and fairness, unwilling to confront the reality of its own racial caste system, chose not to see. The rule changes were technical matters, they insisted. The outcome was determined by play on the court, they claimed. If the black team lost, it must have been because they were not quite good enough, not because the competition had been rigged against them. The psychological impact of such experiences on black athletes and black people more generally cannot be overstated. To work harder than everyone else, to be more skilled and more prepared, to do everything right, and still to be denied victory through the manipulation of rules and systems, creates a profound sense of disillusionment and anger. It teaches that merit alone is not enough, that excellence can be punished rather than rewarded, that the American promise of opportunity based on individual achievement is a lie for those whose skin color marks them as unworthy. Some people internalize these lessons and give up, concluding that the system is too rigged to bother fighting. Others, like Cumberland Posey, respond with fierce determination to succeed anyway, to build their own institutions and create their own opportunities, to find ways around the barriers rather than accepting them as immutable. The Loendi Big Five would eventually disband as players moved on to other pursuits and as the informal nature of early basketball made it difficult to maintain consistent team rosters over many years. But the legacy of what they accomplished, and what was done to them, would persist. They had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that black athletes could excel at basketball, could compete at the highest levels, could employ sophisticated strategies and execute complex plays. They had proven that the racial theories about black mental inferiority were false, that intelligence and tactical acumen had nothing to do with melanin content in skin. And they had exposed, for anyone willing to see, the lengths to which the defenders of racial hierarchy would go to maintain their position, including the brazen manipulation of rules in the middle of competitions. As Cumberland Posey walked off that court after the championship game he should have won, his mind must have been reeling with a complex mixture of emotions. There was surely anger at the injustice, frustration at the helplessness he felt in the face of such blatant manipulation, disappointment for his teammates who had played their hearts out only to be denied by forces beyond their control. But there may also have been a grim satisfaction in knowing that the rule changes had been necessary, that without them his team would have won easily, that the authorities had been forced to cheat because they knew that in a fair competition, the black team would prevail. It was a hollow consolation, offering no trophy or recognition, changing nothing about the outcome recorded in the books. But it was something, a private knowledge that the victory stolen from them had been rightfully theirs. The story demands to be remembered not as a footnote in sports history but as a revealing episode in the larger story of racial oppression in America. It shows how racism operated across all domains of life, how no sphere of activity was free from its corrupting influence, how even something as seemingly straightforward as athletic competition could be twisted and manipulated to serve the purpose of maintaining racial hierarchy. It demonstrates the creativity and determination with which the defenders of white supremacy approached their task, how they would employ any method, however underhanded, to prevent black success. And it honors the courage and resilience of those like Cumberland Posey who kept competing anyway, who kept building and creating and achieving despite knowing that the system was rigged against them, who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose upon them. The gymnasium where that championship game was played is long gone now, torn down decades ago to make way for some other structure, its wood floors splintered and discarded, its lights extinguished forever. The men who played in that game are all dead, their names known now only to specialists in sports history who study the early development of basketball. The newspaper accounts that reported the outcome without mentioning the rule changes have yellowed and crumbled in archival collections, read now only by researchers seeking to understand the past. But the fundamental dynamic that was on display that day, the willingness of those in power to manipulate systems and rules to maintain racial advantage, that has proven far more durable. It persists in different forms, operates through different mechanisms, but the essential pattern remains. When black people achieve success that threatens white dominance, the rules change. The methods become more subtle over time, the language more coded, the procedures more bureaucratic. But the goal remains the same, and so does the effect. Cumberland Posey would spend the rest of his life navigating these realities, achieving remarkable success in multiple fields while always operating within the constraints of a racist society, building institutions for black people because white institutions remained closed, creating opportunities because opportunities were not freely offered. His story, and the story of that championship game where the rules changed mid-match, stands as both testimony to the injustices that black Americans have faced and tribute to the determination with which they have responded, refusing to be defeated even when the game was rigged, insisting on their humanity and their excellence even when the world conspired to deny both. The race may have been stolen, but the truth of who deserved to win could never be erased, not from the memories of those who were there, not from the historical record for those willing to examine it honestly, and not from the broader narrative of black achievement in the face of relentless opposition.